Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Blair Schlecter, Director of Business Development and Programs at Stantec GenerationAV. We are a consulting firm in the autonomous vehicle space. We work with cities, counties, states, private companies, and we consult on all things planning and deployment in AVs. Great to be here.
I am Jeff Tumlin. I'm the Executive Director of the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. We oversee the streets of San Francisco along with the second highest ridership transit agency in the United States. Because of quirk of geography, we believe we have about 75% of the autonomous vehicles testing in California running up and down our hills.
And some refer to Mr. Tumlin as the most dangerous man alive for autonomous vehicle companies. I'm Alex Roy. I was Director of Special Operations at Argo AI and the founder of the Autonocast. And I advise the CEO and other teams at Argo on city engagement strategies, which I have a lot to say about.
And I'm Lilian with the Knight Foundation. My background is in city and tech and innovation data. And for the last 5 years, I've been managing the Smart Cities portfolio for a foundation whose mission is to foster informed and engaged communities. And one of the initiatives that we've tried to run out of that portfolio is by virtue of the fact that we fund across the US, how do we engage in cities where there's heavy testing the residents of those communities and engage them in that rollout and deployment process? So for the last 4 years, I've been working with, we've been investing in Miami-Dade County, San Jose, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. We've been funding those cities, and then we've been funding the University of Oregon's Urbanism Next Institute and CityFi to facilitate and that cohort process and try and capture the learnings of what it takes to stand up technology and innovation capacity within cities so that they can both help the private sector roll out technologies in more responsible ways, but then also engage the public and then actually have a voice in shaping the design and the deployment of the solutions. Lots to learn there, not necessarily all, not necessarily all simple, but that's what I do, and excited to be here.
Great, thanks, Lilian. So we're going to start the conversation to talk about the what of autonomous mobility. Where are they being deployed right now? Which streets are they running on? Which cities are they running? And I'd like to start with Lilian, who just mentioned about your fantastic Knight AV initiative. Could you tell us how it came to being and which communities you're working with and what did you learn from them?
Yeah, for us, we are very geography-centric because we are a foundation that invests in 26 cities across the US. It happened to be that in 2017, we were starting to get a lot of requests from Ford, in particular about deployments they were doing in Miami and in Detroit. And then San Jose was very actively trying to do requests for information to the industry to test on their cities. And so we decided that if we were going to engage in the space, that we really wanted to have an active role in figuring out what that resident piece was. So we developed this initiative in those cities. We included Pittsburgh, which is not a Knight city, but is obviously a place of lots of testing and deployment. And the way that we support the work is literally giving funds. We funded about $1 million each city, county, if you consider Miami, because it's Miami-Dade County, to actually stand up teams internally to be able to liaise and manage and the process with the companies, to also stand up community engagement processes, in some cases, literal apparatus to engage the public around these issues. And then we help them think about how they're going to, we help them actually think through the challenges of deployment, which sometimes are actually very common across those municipalities, even though they're very, very different. And then we also help them to think about what are the incentives to work with the companies, what are the carrots and the sticks that need to be in place. And I think through that process, we've also been learning a lot about what are the various levers that they have. How do you not just sort of put your arms and say no, but figure out where there's opportunity for you to tug and pull and push. And like I said, some of it has been successful, some of it not. I can share more of that later, but that's really what's happened. It's meant to be a piloting process. Part of what we're trying to do is help, and Alex was talking about this yesterday in a different call. Part of what we're trying to do is help our government institutions actually work on a sprint. So we've been, the idea is that there would be various pilots. And so the pandemic put a stop to some of that, but we were able to, over the 2021 time period, actually do deployments of personal delivery robots and devices. We worked with a company called KiwiBot, and we were able to engage over 3,700 people in those communities and actually get their feedback. We were able to assess, like, what did it take for government to actually participate, to have a voice? Where did the company exceed expectations, not meet expectations, over promise, under deliver? And what kind of capacity do these institutions need moving forward in order to be effective? So that's what we've been doing. And then this year, the various municipalities are continuing to do the work and launching new pilots and new initiatives.
Great, thanks. So Pittsburgh, Miami, San Jose, Detroit, I see a kind of pattern similar to what Argo was doing before. I actually have a question for Alex, who is the former director of special operations at Argo. For those in the audience who are not familiarized, Argo AI, one of the leading companies in this field, one of the best in the field, was abruptly shut down by the investors a few weeks ago. Our thoughts and prayers to Argonauts. But Alex, tell us what you did in Argo and how it stood out from the rest of AV companies.
Thanks for your kind words. I can't talk about everything I did, but in the context of this panel, there's a lot of talk about innovation around autonomous vehicles, and most of the discussion is around how they are going to solve everything for everyone overnight. And this overpromising and underdelivering is endemic out of technology companies and Silicon Valley in general, and is a gross oversimplification of what autonomous vehicles can do on any timeline. And it seems that a lot of companies don't understand the history of transport infrastructure and simplify what innovation actually means. So there's technical innovation. Can the vehicles operate at night? Can they operate in the rain? Can they operate in hills? And then there's product innovation, which is, does the product actually solve a problem and how well does it solve it? And then there's just the reality of American cities and geography, where most of which are highly car-centric, some of which, at least in the East Coast, have decent transit, and all of which have enormous transit deserts. So the notion that autonomous vehicles will just arrive in a city at scale and solve problems at scale is unserious. And anyone who claims that's true just doesn't understand the history. So one of the things I got to work on, and this is, I think maybe when the book is written about Argo, was something that Argo, I think, excelled at, was going to many cities and testing for many years before deploying, and engaging with those cities before mistakes were made. And the lessons of Uber are fascinating because we know now, looking back 10, 15 years, that Uber upset many people. I look forward to hearing what Mr. Tumlin has to say about this. And there's the TV show about Uber was wonderful, super pumped. The many veterans of Uber went on to form other mobility companies and repeat a lot of the deployment strategies and repeat the friction that is unhelpful for deploying at scale. Autonomous vehicles, unlike scooters, require much more infrastructure and people to deploy at scale. And so a core principle at Argo, and it's why I joined the company, I was an enormous skeptic of the sector before I joined it, was going to the cities and asking, not telling, asking, what problems are there to solve? How best can we solve them? If you look around the world at how many autonomous vehicle companies are trying to deploy, it appears that they opened up an Uber driver app, looked at the demand map, and said, that's where we deploy. And that's their entire plan. That doesn't necessarily solve a lot of problems for people who live in a city. Because if you want to solve problems for people who live in a city, you want to do the opposite of that map. You want to go into areas where there's no transit and people may not be able to afford taking an Uber every day. And then ask them, where do you go? How often do you need to go there? And how can we help you? and I'll leave it at that. I could go on all day about this. When I was in high school in New York City, I had 2 ways to get to my school, which is pretty far from home. I could take the subway, which was an hour and a half, or I could take a bus, which was a private bus service. If that private bus service wasn't running, and that was a 35-minute ride, I had to take the subway, and I was like 12, which was in the 80s, not the best. It is really important if private companies, autonomous or not, want to solve a transit desert problem, that they can provide uptime, reliability, and earn the trust of the community. So on the day they don't run, there's an alternative that the city can provide. And very few AV developers are thinking that way. And I'm proud of that Argo was.
Great, thanks for sharing, Alex. And
Can I just, like, in my question, I'd love to just riff off of what Alex just said, because I think there's a really, really important story here. So my predecessor at the SFMTA, Ed Reskin, is a character in this TV series, Super Pumped, that tracks Travis Kalanick's efforts to break into the mobility space by breaking a lot of things. And it was personally really painful for me to see the collapse of Argo, because they are one of the very, very few players in this space that actually was looking after the public good and saw partnership with municipalities as not only the right way to do business, but a solid path to long-term profitability. And I feel like not only is Argo's loss indicative of the problems in the industry, but it's particularly indicative of the problems with industry funders who are not asking the right questions and are continuing to reward the worst and most destructive behavior.
If I may, Blair, may I add one more point to this?
Please.
Autonomous vehicles are unique in transportation technologies in that they're not yet completely politicized as a left-right thing. And we know that highways, big trucks, driving cars fast, which I like to do, is kind of right of center, and that pedestrian zones, buses, transit, kind of left of center. Autonomous vehicles have not yet clearly fallen onto a left-right political continuum. And there's still time for them to stay above the fray and be deployed successfully. But that requires an approach to cities that can survive elections. And that means building relationships, not just with elected officials, but with unelected community leaders. And this is something I hope other AV companies will follow up with. Argo had a thing called community advisory boards, which are made up of non-elected officials from across the city, from transit deserts, as well as real estate developers. And these boards, we ask them, like, what can we solve for you? And then give them rides and access and transparency. That was really, very few people were asking those questions. And that is an example I hope other companies will follow, because that was very successful.
So I apparently have a reputation in the industry as being somebody who's very scary or anti-technology. And let me be really clear, I love technology and innovation. And I'm really excited about the long-term prospects of autonomous vehicle technology. As the person responsible, though, for making sure that we manage the public rights of way of San Francisco for the public good, I need to make sure that we're partnering with any technology provider in order to meet the public good. That means defining it. It means asking a set of questions. To what degree does your technology help me move more people in my existing narrow streets, because I'm no longer demolishing low-income neighborhoods in order to widen those streets? Are you just providing greater convenience for the privileged, or are you allowing my streets to move more people by filling empty seats? I need to ask questions like, to what degree are you advancing safety? 30 people a year die on my streets because of traffic crashes. Are you going to advance safety, and particularly advance safety for people outside your technology, because transportation is a complex system? To what degree are you reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Half of California's greenhouse gas emissions come from transport. To what degree are you advancing mobility opportunities for people of low incomes, for people living in underserved neighborhoods, and for people with disabilities? I mean, every other sector of the transport system has to serve people with disabilities right from the get-go. but not new mobility technology. Why is that? Can we find ways of making sure that we're advancing equity? To what degree does your technology investment help ensure career ladders for people without college degrees? There are a lot of very specific questions that we want to ask and ways in which we can quantify how you would measure that. And what we want to do is to partner with industry in order to make sure that we're shaping regulations to craft a level playing field so that the best performers thrive and that we avoid the kind of short-term, quarterly panicked, like quarterly return-driven behavior that we've seen from so many technology providers that not only hurt cities, but more importantly, destroy the opportunity for the industry to thrive. Industry thrives when there is regulated systems that point to common public good outcomes and require that everyone play on that common playing field. And so our invitation is always, please come to us in advance. Let's figure out how to work together. We believe in your potential, but we are also concerned about protecting the city from harm and protecting the industry from the worst players.
And if I can just, sorry, Jerry, we're totally like, I just want to build on that one of the things that we see, especially because we're a funder, not like a venture capital firm, is that the incentives are clearly just not aligned to do any of that, Jeff. And some of that is not the fault of the companies necessarily, it's the fault of the environment in which they live in. So just practically speaking, one of the things that we found is it was actually very hard to find a private company that would be willing to pilot with us and be evaluated. And when KiwiBot actually was willing to do that, in some ways, the performance of the technology for various reasons has some issues, but we have to kind of give them credit just for the fact that they were willing to be evaluated and exposed in some ways. And that wasn't comfortable. And when we release a report and we're gonna put it out and talk to Axios about it, and their bottom line is on the line as well, I think I almost felt like, how do we say this in a way where we don't hurt a company and its staff, et cetera? So I just want to raise up that dynamic because I think you're both totally right, but it's an environment in which none of that kind of partnership and testing and transparency can actually exist. So we also have to kind of call the question on that.
Agreed.
Really well said. Can we just briefly give these speakers a round of applause for, because I think it's really public leadership like this that's driving this technology forward. Otherwise, it's dead on arrival. I want to turn to Blair a little bit, and could you are the business development director for Stantec, GenerationAV, and you actually have a wide global footprint. Could you share with the audience members about some of the other innovative pilots and deployments that you're seeing?
I mean, first of all, I want to kind of piggyback on what was said because I think it's really interesting discussion. Is that I think one of the key questions is why? Why are you doing this? And when we talk to a client or we're just interested in the space, it's not just about having a shiny object that is a new technology. It's what do you want to accomplish, and that should dictate the solution. The other thing is, and Alex and I were talking about this. Is this going to be a long process? I remember John Rasan, who's the organizer of CoMotion, I think it was before the pandemic, and everyone was talking about AVs and they're going to solve every problem and blah, blah, blah. And he got up there and said, hey, it's going to be a bumpy flight. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And it's just like a lot of other technologies that it's going to take time for this to come out. And the fact that companies go out of business, sorry, Alex, or other things happen, it's going to happen as part of this process. It doesn't mean the industry as a whole is failing. It does mean there's challenges that we need to look at, but I think that's an important part of that. And as far as innovative projects, I mean, they're going on around the world. I think the Knight Foundation's work has been really interesting. I think it had a lot of great substantive findings. I know you're working on Trenton Moves on the East Coast. So I think there's a lot of those types of projects, but it's still early days in the grand scheme of things. And so I think part of this is just you're going to have to test and learn some of this. And I think a little bit to Lilian's point, there has to be a little bit of cushion for some of these companies, not in the sense that like they should be acting unsafely, but they should be encouraged to like get out there, work with the public sector. How do we encourage that to happen? How do we create call a safe environment for these companies to operate, but also still be held accountable? And I think that's a key thing that we need to see more of, and so the public and private sector working together.
Great. I wanted to turn the conversation slightly from the what to the where part and see if we can learn from the kind of the wide geographic distribution of the projects here. Which operational design domains are they working on? Operational design domains are the geofence areas of city where these deployments can run, and which sectors, which parts of the city are they effective, which communities are they actually benefiting, and what is not working. So I wanted to turn to Lilian first because, or Lilian or Jeff, because Jeff, San Francisco, as you mentioned, the epicenter of AV testing and deployment. From the person who oversees both the road system and transit system, and on behalf of your residents and your existing road users, can you say, where is this technology working and where it's not?
Yeah, so we have 3 autonomous vehicle operators currently in San Francisco, one providing, Waymo, Cruise, and Zoox. Cruise is currently providing autonomous passenger service. They're the only ones. Waymo is coming in close behind. And we have a whole variety of other technology providers that are competing for permits in order to enter the marketplace in San Francisco. Each provider is operating in a different geography and with the different rules around time of day and weather. What we're finding is that Cruise, I think, made a very wise choice in focusing late nights when there are the fewest pedestrians, the fewest amount of chaos on the streets, and also on our streets that are most normal. So the kind of grid parts of the city, not the steepest, craziest parts of the city. That seems to be where they're having the most success and the least strange challenges.
Mm-hmm. I actually wanted to commend Cruise for actually providing service during the late hours where maybe some of the muni services aren't working. And a lot of people who need a 5 a.m., 6 a.m. job who can not get on a bus, they are probably the group of folks who can actually benefit the most from this kind of mobility.
That's absolutely right. And I hope all autonomous vehicle providers understand this, that the most positive use case for autonomous vehicle technology is late night transportation. It solves not only the situation of when regular public transit isn't really operating, but it provides door-to-door connectivity, which is very important for anyone with personal security concerns. It also provides the opportunity for people to be able to travel securely alone without exacerbating traffic congestion, which has been a severe problem that Uber and Lyft have created.
Yeah. And could the rest of the panelists maybe share one unique aspect in the ODD that you picked, that you've worked on, surprise, lessons learned, or basically just share what's working in the cities that other cities can copy and paste and then really implement by them as well?
You're looking at me?
The entire panel.
I would go in Miami. I moved to Miami because Argo was deployed there, and I wanted to be at the tip of the spear of that deployment. And it was illuminating that if you look at a map of any American city and look at the box created by 2 or more interstates, or where the interstates crisscross the center of the city, guaranteed that was a neighborhood that was bulldozed and destroyed to build those interstates, and that nothing has improved since that happened. And nothing was improved for the people who got pushed out and the remainder in that neighborhood. And no one had gone to ask them, what could be done to help them since. And in Miami, I think it's been like 70 years since that, 95 went through Overtown. And so oftentimes, deploying autonomous vehicles in these neighborhoods can reduce the traffic as opposed to increase it, because instead of 4 families having to buy a car, which is a very onerous thing for them, and bring their kids to school, or parents or family members to a doctor, they could pool, became a traffic reducer, which is very different from throwing vehicles into a neighborhood where they increase traffic, which is a problem potentially solved by good regulation, but potentially also worsened by high friction between a developer and a city that didn't have the conversation in advance. And so the best thing an AV developer can do in advance of deploying is go to the city and ask not where should we put our vehicles, but really how can the vehicles intersect and with transit, such that the vehicles aren't necessarily going all the way into the city center, but they're interlocking with transit options and reducing traffic overall. Again, I can go on about this for hours, but you can't do this without having the conversation in advance. And enemies are made by not having it, and then you can't go back in time and unwind the friction with the city, with the community.
And I'll build on that. I think there's a couple of findings that I think are an interesting opportunity for all of us in terms of how we move the path forward. So one, I mean, it's very clear in our findings that the infrastructure has to be almost like perfect in order for these things to work. Like just American streets, American sidewalks are actually really not designed for a lot of this. And, in the pilot, in the PDD robot delivery pilots that we did, like cracks on sidewalks, the ability to cross, like streets being too wide, all of that impacts the ability of the technology to be successful. And so one of the questions we struggled with was, is that a technology issue or is that an infrastructure issue? So a little bit to build on Alex's point, the opportunity right now is there are billions and billions of infrastructure dollars out there, which cities are going to use to perhaps eliminate some of these highways, perhaps improve the infrastructure. And one of the levers that we talked about internally and that we try to point in our report is that where we can build better infrastructure, we can perhaps pull the industry in order to deploy. Otherwise, there is this there's obviously a pull to go to, as Jeff described, like the nice grid, simple areas. And so cities do have a bit of an opportunity to pull the industry, we believe, with some of the infrastructure if we use these dollars and we invest them in ways where then we can get more equitable deployments and perhaps better use cases and solve some real world issues. The other piece that was interesting in terms of the findings is that as we deploy more and we engage a lot more, we get more of the public engaged with these tools. What we are finding is digital literacy is really, really important. That's not a mobility issue, but the reality is one of the things we found is, like, for example, small businesses or the individuals we wanted to engage, even in Brickell, which is a fairly new development, even in that area, folks did not know how to digitally maneuver or engage with these tools. And so that becomes a problem for the industry, for cities, for everybody, and we're not really tackling it as a country. So there's a lot of these ways in which our digital infrastructure, our own infrastructure, just is not really also prepared or ready to serve a lot of this innovation. And what I think it calls for is, again, more collaboration and more collaboration and thinking outside just your lane of my job is only to build the best autonomous car. We're going to have to get beyond that, and you're going to have to actually think about some of these other issues as well. And I know obviously it's come up through the payment issue, but it's just, we really have to crack this digital literacy piece in order to get more adoption, I would argue.
I don't think I'm pushing back, but I want to say that there are many approaches to deploying an autonomous vehicle, like from a technical standpoint, and there are companies out there who are pushing hard for external infrastructure before deployment because they want to be able to rely on that infrastructure. And I actually don't think that's very wise, because if a vehicle absolutely requires external infrastructure to operate safely and efficiently, that company is going to have a very long haul to scale. And the reality, certainly in this country, is that we're not going to see in a lot of places the kind of investment infrastructure required if the vehicles themselves can't operate without it. So I think it's nice to have and be great to have, but it is entirely possible to build a vehicle that can operate safely and efficiently without V to X, and that's exactly what we should do. So if X is available, even better. But without it, they have to be safe, they have to be able to operate, or they cannot scale. They just can't.
Although I'm going to put in a plug for Lilian's idea, which is, so in the early 20th century, it was the bicycle lobby that got American streets paved. So why in the early 21st century can't we have the mobility tech industry lobby to finally solve the structural deficits in every municipal public works department so that we could actually have our streets paved smoothly again?
And to pick up on both of your points, I mean, it also helps other people too. If the infrastructure is nice, that helps people with access issues, the
Totally.
disabled. So maybe the PDD industry could help with disability access in a sort of an indirect and unintentional way.
That's actually what we found. If you actually made it ADA accessible, you actually would solve the ADA problem and you'd solve the PDD problem. So I think there's double value and benefit. But again, it requires us to actually think outside our lane. And I agree with you. I think they should be able to operate in these environments. But again, this is more of an, like, where are their levers and points and to actually move things along versus kind of just sit and wait for either the technology to get much better or these magical streets that don't
To be
exist.
clear, I'm referring to whether or not there should be transponders and traffic lights. The vehicles have to be able to recognize a red light without a transponder.
Yep.
And I think what you're referring to, something we all agree on, is you need to know where the curb cuts are. Like HD maps, there are people out there who say we don't need HD maps, but it is really important to know where the curb cut is and where people might be crossing the street without the vehicle having to figure it out on the spot and getting it wrong.
But we also need lane striping and crosswalks so that the vehicle can actually identify where it's supposed to be, including in the rain. And for most cities, every year our ability to deliver services shrinks by 2 to 3% because our expenditures grow with the cost of living and our revenues grow at best with inflation. And so every year there's a gap that widens. And this is going to be a problem for all mobility tech, the basic structural flaw in how we fund basic infrastructure in this country and uniquely in this country.
Thanks for your insights. I wanted to maybe go to the roads ahead. If you look at the road ahead and then invite the panelists here to share maybe one piece of advice to either AV companies or city officials or regulators or communities that they're going to work with. Just one piece of advice. What would you advise them? I'll start with Alex because I consider you are one of my personal hero. I consider you to be the visionary of the industry. So do you think we're at the tipping point of the industry? What can they do?
There's no tipping point. There's never going to be a tipping point. It's going to be work, and it's going to take a long time in some places, less time in others. But imagine going back to 1870.
I'm not sure I understand.
I'm not sure. Technology, what's it all about?
That's my typical response to Alex.
Imagine going back to 1870 and there's a company, it's like everyone's going to have an elevator in their house. It's going to be cheap. It's going to work perfectly forever. It's going to be awesome, and you're going to love it. We don't have that today. But we have elevators, and they're great, and they inverted values for real estate, and they change our cities, and it's great. So there's no tipping point. 4 years ago, when I started at Argo, I met Jeffrey Tumlin, and he came on a podcast I was doing with the CEO of Argo, Brian Selesky, and we had a conversation which was illuminating, and we learned a lot. Those conversations should be had in every city with every AV developer and whomever is in Jeffrey's position in advance, because that's the only way to shorten the timeline to deployment. And so the tipping point, there's going to be more like 1,000 tipping points, one for each neighborhood for trust, one for the curb cut, where the curb cuts, one for is the fleet uptime good enough to supplement transit or potentially replace it such that the city can invest elsewhere. All of these things matter. And eventually, when 2 companies, or 3 or 5, arrive in one city, and the worst actor increases traffic, and the best actor is working with the city, and a permitting regime arrives the way it did for the scooter companies, some of those companies aren't going to be able to operate the year after, and someone's going to lose a lot of money. And that's the tipping point. That's the tipping point.
Pretty well said. Jeff, do you have any advice for other city officials or
Yeah.
regulators?
I mean, I'll agree with what Alex said, and I'll take it one step further. If the best players in whatever industry is trying to, do mobility in cities, if the best players come to us in advance and talk about what are the problems we're trying to solve, what are our fears of unintended negative consequences, and develop performance metrics around those things, not only can we help you succeed, but we can also go hand in hand to all of the regulators. And if we're in agreement, those regulators will follow, and they will establish a playing field that rewards the best performers. Even more powerfully, no one has ever asked me to come to one of their funders meetings. Like, can you imagine? Like, if you could take somebody who's actually had real experience trying to manage transportation systems in cities and explain to funders why this is going to take a little bit longer, but the return in the end, as well as the risks of trying to go too fast, cities can help you in ways that you've never dreamt possible. Engage with us.
I have a question for Blair. You have, as clients, many AV developers. How big is the gap between the best actors and the worst among your clients in terms of their awareness of the work that needs to be done to deploy at scale?
Well, I should say most of our clients tend to be actually more in the public sector. So we have a few in the private sector, and I probably shouldn't comment on their particular approaches in the interest of...
As you wish.
But one thing I will say is a couple of things. First, I think the communication is the key. So I agree with what you're saying. I think there's a huge opportunity. I know I represented a business organization, and when you talk mobility with people or you talk AVs with people, it's like, whew, outside of these rooms, I think there's a big opportunity for education and also understanding the why. What exactly you're trying to accomplish? The other thing is a lot of our projects are working with transit agencies to put shuttle projects in to supplement transit, to do things like that. And some of it's driven by the technology itself. And so I'm actually curious from a pure technology perspective where this will drive itself towards, it may take a long time for the robo-taxi to come online in a way that is a threat to anything else. And so maybe the fact that a lot of this is focused on shuttle systems that support transit, that itself may be something that's beneficial, and the technological limitations at this moment in time may be a benefit to public transit and to people getting around more easily. That makes sense.
Great. I'm going to open the conversation to our audience members here. Any questions? Yeah. Feel free to use the microphone.
Hi, I was just wondering, you mentioned AV vehicles going up and down SF streets. Are we talking MDS, data sharing, and learning about safety and what's happening on the streets when we have the AV infrastructure, so we could eventually move to Lyft and Uber and see what's happening in SF?
So in San Francisco, our biggest request from the industry is data. The industry has made all sorts of promises to us, but even the better performers are still not giving us data in order to demonstrate whether they're achieving success. And we don't expect perfection. Like, we're in this together. I operate a transit system, like, crying out loud. Like, there's no perfection. But we do expect solid KPIs and steady improvement or course correction when things are not going well. Right now, for some of our providers, the data that we're getting is from 911 calls and the fire department and social media. Those have been our primary sources of information for problems that are happening on the roadway. This is not a way to build partnerships, and we're fortunate that I think the industry is understanding that and is doing a restart with us in terms of making sure that we have the information that we need in order to manage the system and to start building trust in both directions. We've also, I will admit, not always been the best partner, and we're trying to make a lot of internal staff corrections in order to make sure that we deliver on our end of the bargain as well.
Any more questions from?
Hi. I was lucky enough to work for a while on education, AV education for a nonprofit called Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. It was a really fascinating problem, but also a really important one because I felt like we don't often get tech developers in emerging technology, saying they want to earn the public trust. And they say we need to provide education in order for people to, for us to even earn that trust. And I'm curious, this is especially for Lilian and Jeff, you know, I think when you get down to the metal of what that education really is, it gets harder to, to identify key action points. I'm curious, who are the constituents that most need education? Is it public servants? Is it the public? Is it small business owners? And what are like the things that they need to be educated on that will allow them to be good stakeholders in this technology, so that it is something that there is some like pluralistic democratic participation in?
I can share a little bit about what we found. So if you Google NIGHT, KNIGHT, AV initiative, you'll find reports from the University of Oregon. One of them is actually an engagement framework that we developed, and it was through the experiential learning of the cities, which was that the public will actually need what we call a continuum of engagement. And that for the most part, it takes a while for a person to actually want to get in the vehicle. And in some ways, and this is in some ways a framework for public institutions to adopt, which is like, in partnership with the companies, which is like, you know, how do you start with even like touch and feel, like just exposing the public to the vehicle itself. We talk about autonomous vehicles and we may all kind of know what that looks like, but average person has no clue what that is. So actually really there's a continuum of engagement that can be done. And you actually want to start more with even just exposing people to what the thing looks like, letting them get in and out of the car, just touch it, whatever, before you want to, before you kind of want to go full scale. So you can all look that up. I think what the other thing that we're sort of learning is I think you do want to engage a broader cross section. We maybe foolishly believe, but that a lot of the go-to-market strategies for these companies, I think, are dependent on assumptions which may or may not be actually right about people's preferences. And so what we were trying to unearth through these pilots, it's like, what are the use cases that people in these cities really want? And it's not just, you know, a young single guy who loves cars and maybe wants to sit, you know, in a automated vehicle. It's like, what is the single mom with 2 kids that has certain route patterns? Like, what are her needs and how would she use? And what we started to see is, one, the public was not so anti, like a lot of the feedback was not totally anti the autonomy, as sometimes people would think. It was actually, there were interesting use cases that came up. But I think there aren't enough opportunities to actually have a conversation with everyday people. And so the fear, I think, what we see is the fear on the institutions to talk about this is like, oh, we're gonna have all these like residents upset about us talking about it. And then the companies, we don't necessarily see a huge interest in like real deep, meaningful engagement, but you know, but there's actually a lot of opportunity. It can be very informative, and so then and those insights are both helpful for the public sector in terms of regulating as well as for the company. So that's the spiel there. And then the only other thing I would shorten to say is I do think this point about like small businesses, like really canvassing like where you are testing. All of those dynamics, that's where we unearthed that like many of them don't even know how to, like some of them don't really know how to use a lot of these like electronic payment systems, don't have the capacity. So like the use case again that you're gonna just be able to deliver a bunch of stuff or just kind of park right in front of the thing and you know the business or all of the restaurants around there are just gonna be, that doesn't actually pan out when you actually start to talk to people about it. So that engagement is so important, and we're just not doing enough piloting and then engagement and research around whether that pilot really works. And it's not that scary. People can get it, but they just need to be walked through it.
So everything that Lilian said about the public, but then there are intense mutual education and training needs for police, fire, ambulance, traffic control officers, and street construction crews. So AVs are great under normal circumstances. They don't understand how to deal when there's a human traffic control officer directing traffic around an incident, or even understand not to drive over the fire hose, or that the fire hose isn't a traffic striping line. And these particular incidents have created a lot of challenges in San Francisco and challenges I think that we're working through, but that we need, again, a stronger partnership and ongoing data about improved performance in order to really build trust with particularly emergency services.
That's why the testing is so important, right? The testing, testing, testing. You want to do more of it, test it, assess it, open about it. That's where we're going to actually learn and get this.
And provide the evaluation.
Yeah. And no, totally. That's why. Like transparency evaluation, assess it. The assessment can't be done by the companies on their own. Like it's got to be a mutually. That's part of the framework that we've developed. It's like everybody's a partner. That's where you learn these things.
There's one over here.
First, I saw this gentleman up here, you down here, and then the two women down here.
Yeah, given the limited time that we have, could we maybe gather the questions all at once, briefly, and then we will just open to our panelists.
Okay.
Yep.
We'll just give our question, then you'll combine
Sure.
it.
Yep.
So my question is around what you think is the biggest hurdle to AV deployment and scaling. And from my view, it's safety. And in the public perception of safety, the cities to authorize that it's safe to operate. Do you foresee a common method for safety evaluation between cities, so instead of each city having to do it over and over and over themselves, limited resources, et cetera? Do you foresee a common method of safety approval, and where do you see that coming from?
So are we, sorry, are we
Sure.
taking
Yeah,
all
let's,
the questions?
let's maybe open to
Okay.
the. to
I'm
the
going to need
panelists.
1 hour to answer that.
Federal government.
No.
May I ask one? So, you want us to ask all our questions? So I work for,
What are the other 2 questions?
okay. I work for a city. These are all the things I think about when I think about AVs. But cities don't regulate AVs, and for the modes that we do regulate, we spend a lot of time fighting off the bad actors. I suspect this room is full of cities and good actors. So I'm wondering, how do we get this conversation that is so important in front of the groups that do regulate AVs and in front of the bad actors?
And then we had one more question down here.
Yep.
Hi, I've been part of the good and the bad actors in the past.
It's nice to see you.
Good to see you as well. I think my frustration with autonomous vehicles and even the conversation that we're having here is there are systemic issues in transportation in this country. And we're only talking about the issues that impede the progress of autonomous vehicles, rather than for the sake of addressing transportation ills in our communities. People can't go down sidewalks because they're in bad shape. We don't need perfection, we just need flat. We don't need to have transportation that runs 24/7, but we need an ecosystem that will address people who work at different times of the day and the night. And this is why people saying, are AVs dead? They're not dead, but we have to address systemic transportation issues before we can get to really doing new mobility correctly. So it's just my statement.
But for the record, this is Dr. Salika Talbot, who's recently appeared on the Smoke and Tire podcast, and she teaches at USC. She's a fascinating person. I highly recommend listening to her podcast, recorded recently with Matt Farah.
Woohoo. So yeah, questions on biggest hurdle. How do we ensure the cities actually agree on a kind of a common safety baseline? How do we use AV to actually solve the transportation illness that's embedded in our society? And how do we get the message out to the city officials, the other city leaders?
Can I do a spitfire?
Yep.
Okay. MDS, Mobility Data Specification. It's critical that all cities are asking for the same data and the same KPIs. I think industry will solve for safety. I think industry will destroy itself by worsening traffic congestion in cities and reducing the number of people that city streets can move. That's the bigger problem to solve. Here in California, where so much of the regulatory activity is occurring. The California Cities Transportation Initiative, which is the 7 biggest cities in California, we're getting our acts together in terms of hopefully going hand in hand with industry, but approaching the DMV and the California Public Utilities Commission. And in terms of the larger systemic issues, absolutely yes, that's the whole game, which is why the performance metrics have to include metrics about the transportation system, and particularly its impact on people with the fewest mobility choices, rather than just the performance of the vehicles themselves.
I would just say, I think that part of and this is not someone who works every day in transportation and mobility, but to me, what I see part of the problem is you have 20,000 American cities potentially trying to solve for this like tech new mobility problem, and no real way to organize themselves and create the kind of uniformity and information exchange that enables them to be better, to be more on the front end of these issues, and can actually perhaps help industry, AV or otherwise, be more effective as well. So I think that's a huge problem, and we need associations, we need systems for cities to collaborate and then be able to have a unified front and say this is what we need in order to be effective. On the other front, the other thing that we do see is, I think to your point, we don't, and humbly I say this stuff, I think that a lot of cities really lack that vision that is very resident-centered. Like at Knight Foundation, our strategy is resident-centered smart cities, cities that work for people. I think we lack transportation systems or visions that really work for people in those cities. And a lot of the kind of engagement that we're doing and the kind of engagement infrastructure that we hope we're building through our investments in these cities is so that they can engage the public in a conversation about, yes, AVs, but perhaps other new mobilities too, and how those technologies actually enable or make those public systems better, that transportation ecosystem better. I don't think I have a hard time seeing a lot of American cities like acting in that way. I say that humbly because I know they're all trying, but that level of deep engagement and understanding what the public really wants and needs and actually being responsive, that's where we have to get going to as well. And I suspect that if we had these broader systems where cities could actually coordinate and be more aligned, that perhaps maybe you could do more of that. But those are the things I see missing.
I was going to say about the biggest hurdles, I think one of them, I don't know if it's the biggest, is that most challenging 1 or 2% of driving situations. You were referring to some of those with, fire hoses and police, signals and things like that. When I go running, I look at a driver and the driver waves me across the intersection. How does that work when it's an AV and I'm a pedestrian running or walking or whatever it is? I think a lot of those situations are probably going to be part of these tests and things like that, but I think it's those kind of situations that are going to need to be worked through.
Alex, would you like to conclude?
The worst actors in the sector have made promises that the best actors can never fulfill. Therefore, it is really important to start with the education of, because one brand of vehicle has had an incident doesn't mean the other company's technology is suboptimal. Just like a fundamental thing. Secondly, the promises of mass deployment at scale next year or last year not being met by another company does not mean the technology is suboptimal. And so these overpromises have cursed the sector with expectations that are unrealistic. I'll leave it at that. Well, actually, no, I won't. Okay. The old cliche that all politics is local, all mobility solutions are local because every city's a little different. Mm-hmm. And that means that all safety is local too, because the types of incidents that happen can be very different in one city over another. So yes, we do need some kind of common method of measuring safety, but the data gets worse the more local you get. And so it becomes very difficult to compare two competing technology stacks when they're not working, they're not even testing in the same place. And so we have a ways to go before we have a framework to discuss that, because the word safety itself is not a single number or metric. And that's where I'll leave it.
Well, I'd like to conclude by saying that I think many are saying that 2022 is a challenging time for this industry. It might even be a crisis time for the industry.
It is not a crisis. I'm very optimistic.
Since since Chinese is my first language, I would like to share that in Chinese, crisis means danger and opportunity. With dangers arise, opportunities also arise. I hope the AV companies out there, cities out there can learn from this conversation, learn the hard lessons learned, and we just presented many opportunities for these companies to go into. So I would like to thank our panelists, Lilian, Alex, Jeff, Blair, and thank our audience for your engagement. Thank you.
Thank you.